So welcome everyone. It's truly a pleasure to open this meeting, and the reason I'm saying that is because our municipal leaders endorsed a very significant program, and tonight you're going to learn more about it, and it's going to be reported on all of our municipal websites and for the state and the government and Dutchess County, so that it can be referenced for many decades about our valuable resources. And I am Genevieve Glasson, Climate Smart Communities Coordinator for the Village of Millbrook, and I'm going to hand you over to Leslie, who's my co-lead for the Town of Washington.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Town board members, planning board members, CAC members, CSC members. We probably have some zoning board members out there in the audience too, so thank you all so much for joining in this presentation. This process began about a year ago. In November of last year, we learned that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation was providing technical assistance through funding through the Hudson River Estuary Grant Program. And this grant program was for municipalities that are part of that Hudson River Estuary watershed. So the application required that you apply with more than one municipality, and again, that the municipality was part of that watershed. So Washington qualified, and so did the Village of Millbrook. So we both reached out to each other and thought it'd be a great idea, particularly because both the village and the town we were looking at that time at adopting our comprehensive plan review report and doing some zoning changes to our town's code, and the village was doing the same. Both the village and the town also both had developing climate smart communities programs, so the timing was really optimal for us to try to participate in this project. It was also recommended in both our 2015 comprehensive plan and again in our addendum to the plan that we pursue a natural resources inventory. So that was sort of the thinking behind it. We then reached out to Clinton, who's also part of the watershed, to ask them if they would join us in our application, recognizing that there was strength in numbers, and they were also very interested and organized and wanted to pursue this opportunity with us. So we were thrilled in December when we found out that we were selected, and it's been an absolute pleasure and delight to have the opportunity to work with this task force and to work with DEC and Cornell Cooperative this past year. I want to recognize the task force, both task forces that are here tonight from the village and the town, and everybody who's participating has really dedicated so much of their time and energy and thought to this process. So we all owe them a debt of gratitude. For Washington, we have our CAC chair, Margaret Schneibel, who's also a member of this Climate Smart Communities program as well. Richard Phillips, who's a member of our planning board and also a member of our Climate Smart Communities task force, and myself. And then for the village, we have Jen Glasson, who just introduced herself, who's the local champions participant and Climate Smart Communities chairperson for the village. She's also a member of the village planning board. Shannon Ledoux, who's a member of the Conservation Advisory Commission, the CAC, and also a member of the Climate Smart Communities task force. Peter Groffman, who's a village resident and environmental expert. Mike Herzog, who's a village trustee and chairperson of the Village Liaison to Climate Smart Communities. He's also a member of the Village Shade Tree Commission. So this group not only helped with all of the mapping and organizing all of this material, but also in drafting the report, which you all received a copy of the draft report by email. This team, along with Christine Vanderlyn, who's not here unfortunately tonight, has been absolutely incredible. So I wanted to recognize them and introduce them to you. Ingrid Hackle, who is a conservation and land use specialist with the Hudson River Estuary Program at Cornell University. Sean Carroll, who is a senior GIS, which I just found out means Geographic Information Systems. He's basically a map expert, an environmental educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Dutchess County. and Anna Palmer, who is a source watershed specialist with the Hudson River Estuary Program, and also a member of the New York State DEC. So before I turn it over, I wanted to remind us all why we're here and why it's important to know where our natural resources are. We often talk about, our desire, particularly in Washington, to protect our natural resources, but it's hard to do that if we don't know where they are, and it's hard to make really informed and thoughtful land use decisions and zoning code if we don't have a better understanding of our natural resources. So with that tonight, this is just an introduction to the work that we've done. This is a draft. We want to hear your feedback, get your questions and comments, and then we will present the community final draft in October at the Community Day. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ingrid. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Jen, for your introduction. My name is Ingrid Heckel, and as Leslie said, I'm a conservation and land use specialist with the Hudson River Estuary Program. Can everyone hear in the back? Good?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. If you need us to speak louder, let us know. So I'll be co-presenting with my colleague Anna Palmer, and as Leslie said, our other colleague Christine has also been very involved in this project and couldn't be here tonight. And we've been working with our partner Sean Carroll on this project and the volunteer members of the task force, and we really thank them for all of their work on this project. It's been wonderful to work with you, and I really enjoyed learning more about the town and village through this process. And I also want to say that this has been a partnership with the town of Clinton as well. So when we offered this opportunity, we were encouraging intermunicipal collaboration, and the town and village were interested in partnering, and Clinton also wanted to create an NRI. So it's been a great opportunity for these three community task forces to come together and promote conversation and dialogue and learning about shared resources, and hopefully that conversation and collaboration can continue past this project. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the natural resources inventory. As Leslie said, this is a draft. We wanted to do some outreach at this point to help you understand what's included in the NRI and provide the opportunity for review and input before we finalize the inventory in the fall and then by the end of this year. Before I go further, the estuary program is a unique program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, established to help people enjoy, protect, and revitalize the Hudson River and its valley. And we work throughout the 10 counties bordering the tidal Hudson River, shown in the green area on the map, to achieve these many benefits. Within the Hudson River Estuary Program, I'm part of our conservation and land use team, and we work with municipalities and other partners to identify and conserve important habitats and natural areas in the watershed. And Anna is part of our watershed team, and she works with communities to help them protect drinking water supplies, and that her team works more broadly to promote protection of clean water in the watershed and in the Hudson River. So my team has been working with local governments for over 20 years to promote conservation and environmental planning, and we encourage this basic planning framework that begins with identifying what you have. As Leslie said, we really need to identify and understand where our natural resources are if we want to have any hope of protecting them for the future. And the natural resources inventory is really the foundation for that. And with the NRI, you can then collect community input and begin to develop local priorities for conservation and establish plans and policies to protect and manage your resources for the future. So natural resources inventory is basically a compilation of information about your local natural resources, including features like geology and soils and topography, water resources, including groundwater and aquifers, as well as our surface water, streams, lakes and ponds and wetlands, habitats and information about wildlife and plants, information about land use like agriculture, as well as information about climate. And in some cases, NRIs include cultural resources like historic resources or recreation sites, scenic areas. We didn't go into that category in this project just because it was a little beyond the scope of what we could do in this short time frame, but that could be an additional piece that the town and village work on in the future. So there are many different reasons to create an NRI. It's a wonderful educational tool. It provides this unified reference for information about natural resources and environmental features to aid in planning, designing, and reviewing new development proposals, and is the foundation for developing or updating your land use policy and plans, like the comprehensive plan and zoning. And it can be a valuable tool for landowners to help them understand what occurs on their property and how they fit into this broader context, and help promote stewardship of private lands. So Leslie already told us about the members of the project. We began working on the NRI back in January, and so we've been meeting every month or so, roughly, and we're hoping to finish up the revisions on the inventory by the end of this year, and to bring it back to the town and village board for adoption probably early in the next year, in 2024. And so there's been great diversity of members of local boards and committees present in this project, which has also been excellent, I think, to have so many different groups involved in learning about the resources and crafting this document. We've been consulting a lot of different data sources in the process, looking at state and regional data, as well as data from Dutchess County, town and village comprehensive and master plans, and other studies like the county's water supply protection plan, and studies that have been done for Wappinger Creek, the townwide habitat map that was created by Hudsonia, and we've also been bringing in data available from the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. So the NRI includes 20 maps. There are also 6 or 7 additional overview of the maps in each of these chapters, and just a highlight of 1 or 2 maps in each of them. We don't have time to go into every single resource tonight. But we encourage you, we're going to share the link if you haven't seen it already, where you can access the maps and report. We're hoping to have time after the presentation, if you haven't already looked at some of the examples of maps. Sean is here to help answer questions about the maps too. And as I'm going along, feel free to stop me if you have a question. So I'll start off with the climate section of the report. Presents existing climate conditions and future projections. And it draws on data from New York State's climate assessment, and also local data from the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. So we know that temperatures are rising. Average temperature in New York State has already risen over 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900. Dutchess County has seen increases of one, kind of unimaginable, I think. But we're already experiencing these changes. There's also, that's going to result in an increase in extreme heat events in particular, which is a big concern. There's a projected increase of 26 to 60 additional extreme heat days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit per year by the end of the century. So we're presenting climate information. The chapter also talks a little bit about what's happening at the state level with climate policy and local actions that are being taken by the climate smart task forces in town and village, and the role of natural resources of our natural environment in helping both to mitigate, offset our carbon emissions, and contributing to adaptation to the effects of climate change. So for temperature, for example, having an abundance of green space, of forest, of street trees in the urban village center contributes to cooling during those extreme heat events. In terms of precipitation, which is the other main impact we're anticipating in inland communities like Washington, about 21% of the town is classified as steep. The town has some existing regulation for steep slope areas under the open space subdivision regulations, so those areas can be excluded from the buildable areas. calculations. And in Millbrook, there are design standards that list steep slopes as potential lands unsuitable for development, which the planning board can require to be set aside during subdivisions as well. So these are some of the most environmentally sensitive areas that can contribute to erosion and sediment, and they're, they have all obvious constraints for development.
Yep. So that map there, or any of the maps, we weren't able to print all of the maps that are on these, and there's a lot of maps. So when we provide everybody with a final draft of the draft, there'll be a link to all the maps if they want to look at the steep slope map or any of the other maps that we haven't.
Yeah. So currently these maps are all online. You can download them and look at them on your computer. At the end of the project, we'll provide a full set of printed maps to the town and the maps for the village. And there also will be maps included in the report that are kind of at a scale of the report paper size.
I'm going to talk about the water resources chapter. I wrote this chapter for the NRI, and I'm going to show you 2 of the 5 maps that are included in this chapter. I'm going to go over the drinking water resources map and the watersheds map, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Ingrid to talk about wetlands. But the Hudson River Estuary Program, we operate thinking about watersheds. Watersheds are really key concept for making decisions, local land use decisions. It's a good way of thinking about where you're nested within the larger ecological landscape. And it can help inform local land use and water resource decisions. So the definition of a watershed is an area of land that drains to a particular water body, a specific point. And like Leslie said, half of the town is within the Hudson River Estuary, which is why you're able to get technical assistance from the Hudson River Estuary Program. But it is helpful to think about, there's really large watersheds like the Hudson River Estuary, but then that can be subdivided into smaller basins or catchments. And if you think about local land use decisions from a watershed perspective, you can understand how a impact that I'm putting on the land here, which of the streams is it going to be impacting? How is precipitation, when it falls onto the land and flows over the landscape, which water body is that going to drain into, and which water body is it going to impact? And watersheds are separated by these high ridges and drainage divides. So you can understand if it's going to be flowing one direction or another direction. You can kind of anticipate where the water resources are. And we think about, oftentimes we separate groundwater and surface water features because they operate a little bit differently, but they are both part of the hydrologic cycle and they are interconnected. So the drinking water resources map is interesting because you'll see that there's a lot of aquifers here, which are technically groundwater resources, but they are also the areas within the town that are the most abundant and vulnerable aquifers are along the water bodies. You'll see they're kind of at those low points. And that's, it's important to protect these aquifers from potentially contaminated land uses. And specifically, we wanted to bring your attention to the area in yellow, which is kind of like a sub-catchment of, which is the area of land that provides drinking water to the village. So the village of Millbrook has a community public water supply system that feeds, or that serves 1,500 people within the village. They're all served by a centralized system that collects water that's drained from the Millbrook and the Shawbrook, which are drained in that area in yellow. And then it gets filtered down to an infiltration gallery, which is a really shallow aquifer. And then it's treated and pumped into, it's treated and then distributed to the consumers within the village. And one item that we identified when we were looking at this is we wanted to look at the current protections for the drinking water supplies. And currently, the town of Washington does have an aquifer a protection overlay district, but it's from a very old map, and the current aquifer protection overlay district that the town regulates in their zoning code it kind of follows the areas that are in dark blue and light blue. But then the village has a law that says that anything within zones 1, 2, and 3, which are all the purple, it's blue and purple, all of those zones, because they're feeding the village's drinking water supply, the village of Millbrook should be consulted if there's anything that's impacting those resources. So we identify that there's an inconsistency between the two codes, which is interesting. And then the area that doesn't have any color in it isn't protected at all, even though everything within that yellow boundary is impacting the quantity and quality of the village of Millbrook's drinking water supply system. And it's important to consider that when you're deciding on local or on projects that are coming to your town board.
And then if I could add that, where you're referencing the map on the screen here a lot, we realize it's hard to see from there, but we also do have a printout here. So please feel free to take a look at that at some point.
Yeah, and the ground and surface water features are connected, and they're particularly connected in these mapped areas, but the entire town and village are reliant upon groundwater for their drinking water. I already mentioned where the village is getting their drinking water supply from, and the town primarily is reliant on private individual drinking water wells that aren't regulated by anybody. So that is also important to realize, that it's just up to the individual homeowner, landowner to protect their own well from potentially contaminating land uses. And again, just to reiterate this concept of a watershed, because it's really helpful for thinking about where the impacts of particular area, development in a particular area, where that's going to impact. And one drainage divide to be aware of, which is what I mentioned earlier, is that the eastern third of the town, these two sub-watershed catchments, they are both draining into the 10-mile river, which drains into the Housatonic River, which then goes into the Connecticut River and empties into the Long Island Sound. So this drainage divide is separating. So that means all of the rain and snow that's falling on the eastern side of that drainage divide is draining somewhere else, not within the estuary. But everything on the western side is draining into the Hudson River Estuary watershed. And the USGS, the United States Geologic Service, they've created watershed maps for the entire country, and the framework is defined by the Hydrologic Unit Code. So this is HUC 12, which is a useful scale for thinking about local water resources. And most of the town and all the village is draining into the Wappinger Creek, which is a really important tributary to the Hudson River. And then there's a little tiny portion of the Fishkill Creek watershed down here. So that's draining into the Fishkill Creek. So we can think about where the downstream impacts are of your land use decisions.
Leslie, just by the way, YouTube Live is not working. Okay, so we are recording, but I got one text from someone for YouTube Live, it's not. And I reset, and it's still not live. It's an operator issue, I'm sure, but I don't know what it is.
Thank you, Jen, for recording it. That's great.
We'll post it tomorrow on the website. Sorry.
Thank you. That's all right. So the last map we'll talk about in this chapter is the wetlands map. So wetlands include swamps and marshes and wet meadows and vernal pools or woodland pools. And we have a variety of different mapping sources for wetlands. There's no comprehensive map showing every wetland out there. You really need to ground truth or verify wetlands on the ground. But they're some of our most important habitats, because not only are they used by so many species of wildlife for habitat, they provide important functions for water. They help to absorb and reduce the rate of runoff into streams, and really help with flood control and filtering out sediments and pollutants and contaminants from water, so that the water that's leaving wetlands is cleaner than the water that enters them. So they're known as the kidneys of the landscape. And I'm zooming in just to show you a little closer up picture, which I know is still really far away for you, of the map. So the town, as I said, is fortunate to have this habitat map from Hudsonia. Even though this was done back in 2004, it's still a really valuable source of information because Hudsonia biologists really painstakingly evaluated aerial photographs and soil maps and topography and did a lot of ground truthing and field work to verify the habitat map. So we've included the green areas mapped by Hudsonia as wetlands, which pick up many more wetlands on the landscape than existing state or federal maps. The state regulatory maps are still shown here. We know those are very inaccurate maps. The state is actually in the process of updating state wetland protection, and so those regulatory maps will no longer be in effect starting in 2025. We've also included soil data because that can be a useful clue to additional potential wetland areas. And these purple areas are vernal pools or intermittent woodland pools that were identified by Hudsonia during the habitat mapping project. And those are particularly important habitats for many amphibians, which use them for breeding in the springtime. And they often don't show up on public maps because they're too small. The town does have a wetlands and watercourse law and regulates wetlands a quarter acre or larger. So that probably doesn't include many vernal pools, but is still really valuable protection, especially because federal protection of wetlands just dramatically decreased. The EPA estimates that federal jurisdiction over wetlands just decreased by 63% based on a Supreme Court decision in June this year. So it's great that the town is able to fill in those gaps and help better protect these resources. And this map can help to identify areas that have been mapped as potential or known wetlands.
Ingrid, I just wanted to add something about the Hudsonia study that was funded by the Dyson Foundation 20 years ago. And I contacted Hudsonia maybe a year ago when we started this process to ask them whether we needed to update that. And they said that unless there's been some dramatic development or some major shift to your landscape, that they should be exactly, that this report is as updated as it really could or should be. And again, unless there was a big parking lot, there's some structure or something that would really affect the work that they did 20 years ago. So they were comfortable with that report.
Yeah, I'll touch on the habitat map shortly, but I agree. I think it's still a really valuable picture of habitats in the town. Of course, any of these maps really should be verified for legal purposes, but they did so much field work to verify habitats and identify things that you wouldn't be able to classify just by looking remotely at aerial imagery. They actually were looking at vegetation that's present. So there's a lot of useful information there. And as you said, unless those areas have been developed, the habitats are likely still there. Maybe they've changed slightly, but unlikely to have disappeared. So the habitats map is part of the biodiversity chapter, which also includes state-mapped important biodiversity areas and information about large forests and the regional forest context of important forest areas in the town. So this is that image of the habitat map. I'll show you a closer-up image. And this is showing the village area, and even the village retains some significant open spaces and natural habitats, especially in the south and western portions. This just gives you a much more detailed idea of where those are and how habitats on a parcel relate to the surrounding area, and as well as the location of more rare or significant, like unusual habitats in the town. So I won't go into too much detail again, other than just to encourage you to continue using this data, and which we've incorporated to other maps. Also, the stream mapping from Hudsonia is really excellent and better than state and federal stream maps, and it picks up many of the smaller seasonal streams, the intermittent streams in the town, which are really important to the overall stream network and water quality and quantity in our streams and rivers. So this is the important biodiversity areas map. Oh, I did want to say one more thing here, which is that there was some discussion during this process about how Hudsonia, there are these gray areas, and this is developed areas, And Hudsonia has some threshold for areas they didn't map as habitat. But of course, we discussed that there could still be, and are still important habitats or natural areas, street trees, green spaces within developed areas that are important and providing functions. Just because these areas aren't mapped as habitat doesn't mean there's no value at all. So be aware of that. Similarly, with this map, it's important to note that these are not the only important biodiversity areas. These are areas mapped specifically around known locations of rare animals that have been documented in the town. So the state maintains databases of rare and protected species. In the town, we know there are occurrences of the endangered bog turtle, of threatened Blanding's turtle, and hide-billed grebe, and also special concern species like the box turtle and I believe wood turtle. There's also threatened timber rattlesnake present, and some declining fish species like our native brook trout and American eel. So there's modeling shown here for significant habitat areas likely to support those known locations of rare species, but not every part of the town has been surveyed, so there could be other occurrences, and of course biodiversity includes more than just rare species. It's the diversity of all of our species and communities and ecosystems. The land use chapter in the NRI includes maps showing agricultural resources and conserved lands and publicly owned lands, conservation of public lands. This is showing the agricultural resources map, which shows farmland soils in the town and parcels receiving an agricultural exemption. So I believe 40% of the town is dedicated to production agriculture and receiving that tax abatement. According to Cornell Cooperative Extension, 21% of those operations are dedicated to beef or livestock. That's the greatest, the highest, largest percentage of agricultural operations, followed by 15% dedicated to horse farms. And this chapter also includes some information about forestry and the lands that in the town that are enrolled within the state's 480A tax program for forest management. And actually 25% of the town is currently enrolled in that program. So of course, we hope that the planning and zoning boards will use the NRI as a reference for project review. One way to standardize that process could be to incorporate information from the NRI to application checklists for information that applicants are required to submit. They can consult the NRI and check for resources present on the site. We are also welcome to provide training to the planning and zoning boards if they would like to have a presentation and a session about using the NRI. We could help do that. The NRI can also be used as a foundation for planning for open space inventories or plans, or for your next comprehensive plan update. This is an example of priority open space areas identified in the Pleasant Valley Open Space and Farmland Plan, which was completed about 10 years ago and won an award at the time. It's a great open space plan example, and that basically goes a little further to establish priorities and think about strategies and goals for how to protect those values for open spaces in different parts of the town. And lastly, the NRI can aid in interpreting and enforcing your existing code, and we drew on different examples of the code that relate to resources shown on the map in this presentation. So in the town, there are agriculture and aquifer protection overlay zoning district regulations, as well as the open space subdivisions and wetland and watercourse law. And some examples in the village include your subdivision regulations and flood damage prevention law. So thank you for joining us tonight and listening, and many thanks again to all the volunteers from the communities who helped out with the project. Again, the purpose tonight is to share what's in the NRI and how it can be used, and also again offer you the opportunity for input on the draft before we make our final revisions. So the full document and all of the maps are available from this link, which we can circulate after the presentation. It should be, I think, on the websites, right? And please submit any questions you have after tonight to Leslie by email. And we're happy to answer questions you have. Thanks.
Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah.
So once the final draft is put together and you have everybody's input, this is a tremendous amount of work. It's amazing to have all this in one place. What is the next step then for making it an official part of our processes for our zoning and planning board?
Yeah, as I mentioned, there are some different approaches to doing that. I mean, it can be incorporated to the procedures, like to the application checklist that you're using, for example. It can be used in that way, or it could be done more formally through code updates. If you wanted to reference the NRI in the subdivision regulations, for example, there are examples of how to do that so that the maps become more formal reference for certain regulations. And that publication I mentioned has a lot of great examples.
What are most municipalities doing?
Well, we've been doing this work now for, we published this guidance on developing the NRI back around the beginning of 2015. So we've had communities adopt their NRIs by resolution. We've had a handful of communities go on to adopt local laws that formally integrate their NRIs to seeker, for example. Some communities require referencing the NRI for seeker applications. Some of them only require it if there's an EIS involved, but there are different ways that could be done. And a bunch of communities have also integrated their NRIs to comprehensive plan updates. So that could be done either as a standalone thing right now after you complete it, or whenever the next update comes along. So it could be an amendment right now. Mm-hmm.
So roughly, when is the final report supposed to be done?
By the end of this year, probably sometime in December.
Okay. So I guess we can follow on the previous question. So are there recommendations coming out of actions for the municipalities to take? Expected?
Good question. So the NRI itself doesn't include formal recommendations, but there's been some discussion of putting together a memo with some recommendations related to the NRI. We haven't started work on that yet.
Okay.
And I think one step, Tim, for example, when we talked about those discrepancies between village maps and town maps, making sure that we're coordinated and we're all sitting at the same book, for example, that is one. And of course, these updated maps will help us do that, but that's an obvious step to take, now that we have the updated information.
And you're looking to New York State to do that? Is that who's going to be doing the updating of the maps?
No, we just, so what happens is, so we right now, the town, we were considering adopting, we have updated maps from the CPRC report. And Mary Alex, our clerk, reached out and said, should we put that in and adopt it? And I said, let's wait, because they took the CPRC maps and we updated them even further.
Okay.
So the most updated maps that we have anywhere are the draft maps that we have right here.
I see.
That
Okay.
has taken all of that information into account.
All right.
And so adopting them so that they are a resource for the town. How we do that is up for discussion, village and the town boards respectively, about what is the best course to do that. But there will be, we're talking to task force about what other things we think would be recommendations we could make to each of our respective boards about next steps.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm on the neighboring Sandburg Climate Smart Task Force, and a lot of this mapping is for conservation of natural resources. They're wondering if there's new metrics mapping for climate smart community resiliency. Are there new mapping metrics that are tools for that?
Well, Short answer would be no. I mean, it's a lot of the same information. It's information about wetlands and riparian areas and forests. In terms of the natural areas, we didn't include, like, there are other mapping analyses coming out showing things like urban heat island, right, where you have extreme, more concentrated heat because there's a lot of impervious surface and pavement. So we didn't go into that detail. We discussed including some modeling from the Nature Conservancy showing resilient areas for biodiversity under climate change, but we decided ultimately, I won't go into detail, not to include that because we have so much great information about the biodiversity that's present here now in the town from the habitat map and other sources. But in terms of like natural areas and climate resilience, it's definitely woven throughout the report, or at least that's what we're aiming for, to weave it in addition to the separate climate chapter.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, we identified critical habitats.
Mm-hmm.
If there was any consideration of identifying, critical waterways, based on modeling, based on modeling projections and increased rainfall, increased heat. If there was any discussion of adding that additional information, since we now have this new task, which is, trying to build our community's resiliency.
Yeah. Well, I would say I'm sure there's new, and maybe this is something you could weigh in on.
Yeah, one data set that some communities, or one piece of information that some communities have that kind of touch on that is like the culvert assessments. So doing an assessment of the town's road infrastructure for both aquatic organism passability, but also projecting which culverts and bridges are going to withstand higher larger storm events. So if it's something we're most of the county has been assessed via this protocol that a lot of the Northeast uses. And I've actually worked with a number of towns in Dutchess to put together these kind of culvert assessment plans, which can definitely tie into the NRI. So if that's something Stanford is interested in, it's something we can look into getting done and then incorporating into the NRI as well.
That is a formal program that Cornell offers, doing the culvert assessment, the road assessment around flooding. I mean, to me, when you say resiliency, I think part of that it would be kind of flood prevention and looking at where there are issues with your culverts and your dams. And you guys have a program for that, because I know we talked about perhaps applying for that last year. And so I think it starts in maybe in January of every year.
It's something that we get funding through from the estuary program
Right.
to put together. Where I'm not our funding for that kind of technical support that's going forward is still a little unsure.
Okay.
But if it's there's always other funding sources that we could search for if that's something that the community is interested in doing.
Well, yeah, we did include that information about the culverts that have already been mapped and assessed, which ones are known barriers, both for aquatic organism passage and likely to be exacerbating flood problems.
Yeah, I mean, as to your point, you already have the wetlands, which is so critical to absorbing this extra rainwater, but maybe if there was ones that are even more critical than others, it's that kind of planning for disaster is different than conserving.
Yes, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't we do a flood mitigation plan?
So one of the maps also shows the FEMA flood zones, so it shows the areas that are within the 1% and the 0.2% flood risk zone. So that's incorporated in this as well.
And I've heard that FEMA will be updating that mapping, that there's efforts underway to update floodplain mapping based on climate projections. That's not available right now. One thing I meant to mention earlier is that the county is also working on a county-wide natural resources inventory, and that's going to be an online map that is interactive. You can zoom in, similar to parcel access, but with all of this environmental data. I think it'll be wrapped up sometime later this year or next year, and it'll be a great companion tool to this. This is really nice because it's focused on the town and village, and the report really drills down into information about your town village. But then you can use the county's online mapper to be able to interact, like zoom into a parcel level, turn layers on and off. And that'll also be great because they'll be able to update and add additional information on an ongoing basis. This should hopefully be updated, maybe sometime 5 to 10 years from now it'll be updated, or you could add little amendments to it over time. But the county system will be a little bit more dynamic.
One of the things that I think you may find is important is using the resources that Cornell has at its disposal at a local level, not just for municipal leaders, but for citizens who are interested in finding out exactly what can we do. And you can do, for instance, we found out this year that we were going through the Climate Smart Communities pledge list of 115 different pledge items you can take. One of them is looking at your emergency management plan, not from just a preparatory, but from a resiliency aspect and what you can do. And I know I spent between, I guess, November and January of 22 into 23, 3 months working with the Cornell rep who sat down with me, and we spent a number of hours just going over our emergency management plan. And after going over it, she gave a presentation to the board with recommendations of things that we can do to tweak the emergency management plan in conjunction with the town at some point going forward. But it's based on understanding what we do in the NRR, and that is locating your water recesses, locating your streams, and knowing what impact they are having and what changes may have occurred in the last 20 years that would impact, therefore, your effective increased precipitation, increased damage in extreme storms, and that type of thing. So those kind of tools are out there, but I think Cornell and a lot of the county opportunities are taken for granted, and many citizens don't even realize, for instance, that the Millbrook Village water supply is groundwater source. So the water they're getting, the water they're drinking is not water that's down 200 feet below the ground. It's surface water that is literally coming into streams and being treated, and it's coming from purification that takes it 20 feet below the ground.
It's the climate issue.
It's the climate issue. So I think every landowner has a stake in understanding the basic parameters of what's in your community and what's on your property, and therefore what does that have to do with your neighbors' impacts and with impacts on the whole population.
Back here.
I'm not sure if this was addressed or not, but I was wondering if there was consideration given to corridors. When you're looking at biodiversity and fauna, they do not remain stationary in one spot. And if there's any consideration in the maps given to the movement and the corridors that they need.
Yeah, it's something we've discussed, and unfortunately we don't have a great data set available showing wildlife corridors. We have the habitat mapping. The Nature Conservancy data that I mentioned for resiliency is based in part on connected habitat, and is good. We've used it as a proxy for corridors in other places, but the real one of the real problems with that data set is that it does not include agricultural areas in its definition. So it really excludes those areas, and it makes it look as if there are big parts of the town that would be devoid of habitat, which are in fact farms, and that may not really be an accurate depiction of how wildlife are moving across the landscape. So we didn't have, unfortunately, we were limited to the available data we have. And I do think just looking at where the habitats are, where you have large examples of connected forest in particular, and those riparian corridors, the stream corridors, those are likely to be your areas that have important, are important for wildlife movement. So that's a place to begin. And certainly, perhaps in the future there'll be more data available identifying priority areas for that.
When we do this natural resource inventory, do we include like invasive species, natural species, things like this, that I know it's much more granular, but very important in consideration, especially for habitat preservation and is that on them?
Yeah, there's discussion of invasive species in the biodiversity chapter, and I think we may even be including an appendix related to invasive species. That's come up. We don't have mapping for invasive species. There's no state data set showing where those different invasives are. It's more point-based on reporting to the state, and it's not. It wouldn't really be valuable for this type of project, I would say.
Yeah, a lot of the invasive mapping is done kind of by citizen science. So people who like go out and actually report with with their phone and take a picture of something in their yard and say, this is where this invasive is. That's kind of the only scale that we have that data mapping.
What about drainage? I'm just wondering, like for instance, all this increased rainfall, pesticides, people put fertilizers are getting pushed into waterways. We have an antiquated waste treatment facility here in the village that is probably way past its useful life. Are these things being taken into account?
So we have information about water quality monitoring in the report, and I don't know that there's discussion specifically of runoff, like pesticide runoff, or that issue, but there's also documentation of the permitted facilities, like the wastewater treatment plant discharge, and where you can link to those reports.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you think about flooding and you think about a watershed, like because they're reliant on topo lines, when the floodwaters will rise to the same level all across the basin, like it rises kind of like a tub. So that's picking up all the contaminants that are within that same flood height, that same level, all up and down that watershed basin, which is really interesting to think about. So it's picking up all the contaminants that are in that area when the flood levels rise and then they fall back down. So that's why it's so important to think about the protecting your vulnerable aquifers from potential contaminants that are on the surface of the land, because it gets filtered back down and the waters go back down.
Yeah, and that's where those maps of the aquifer zones and the sub-watersheds that Anna was alluding to will be important for your reference, so you can say, well, if something happens at point A, what's going to be affected downstream, or what is downstream?
And all of it will end up, someone's going to use this water. Poughkeepsie will use the water, so you can't be looking at this in isolation.
No, absolutely.
And that's aquifer and neglect someone else.
No, you're spot on. That's why I help to coordinate the Wappinger Creek Intermunicipal Council, and this is why we encourage communities to get involved in watershed groups, especially intermunicipal level, so that towns upstream are taking into consideration. Okay, what we do up here is going to affect downstream towns, communities. So it's great that you're thinking about that, and we're hopefully capturing that in the NRI as well.
I'm sorry, I was going to say maybe one last question, because I know I promised everybody we would finish at 7, but please ask your question, and then Ingrid, you're up here if you want to ask a question or send an email.
Perhaps briefly, I just want to go back to the climate question, maybe ask a little more specifically. You showed historical data and you offered up projections. Have you seen, or does any of this show the impact of the historical data on our natural resources? The projections gives a view into the future of our natural resources.
Impact of historical land use, or?
No, you showed us data, you showed us temperature.
Yes.
You showed us changes over time, and you projected it going forward. Does the data show the impact of those historical changes today?
Temperature.
You talked about increased rainfall, you talked about intensity.
We would have had to have a baseline back then for which to
You have to
compare, which we
compare
don't.
this map to those maps.
Yeah.
We don't have those maps.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, that's the
Yeah, I tried to ask it more.
This is an awareness.
no, it's a great question, and that's why
In
we're
terms of what we're preparing for,
Right.
what will these projections, what will the impact be?
yeah, and that's we have to look at kind of small time scales, because that's the only comparison compared to data sets we have, right? From I mean we have ortho imagery, satellite imagery from the county from land use that goes all the way back to the 30s. But with regards to a lot of these more finer scale habitat data, water quality data, it just doesn't exist that far back.
Yeah,
I mean, the town had never done a habitat study until that study that was funded. been commissioned on behalf of the town 20 years ago. There was no prior. That was the first habitat study that they did. So we wouldn't have a reference point to know what was happening with those habitats before.
But at the same time, again, with this
But
kind
now
of
we have a marker.
Right, yeah,
Level set going forward.
right, and it's looking at these kind of historical aerial imagery, seeing changes in the land, seeing how farmland became developed and how wetlands diminished with during the 50s and the 60s, and how a lot of that's changed. You can make inferences on how now we're protecting wetlands and we're seeing that their numbers are not decreasing. Well, in theory, they're remaining the same. So we can make inferences on how that how that'll buffer for larger storms. And,
I'm suggesting that data would be helpful in planning.
Of course.
So that we can gain public support for things that with
Right.
specific data and information.
Right. So it's so that's where this is. This is great. This is that, like Leslie was saying, this is that benchmark that'll start. Well, I mean, not to say we don't have other data that pre-exist this, but it's a great benchmark for all of this data and information going forward. Yeah.
Ingrid, Anna, thank you all so much. Thank you everyone for joining.
And I'm happy to stay around if anyone wants to stay around for another 10 or 15.
Even just like the last 2 years.